What happens when a Hollywood icon walks onto a talk show expecting a celebration and instead gets ambushed with accusations? The tension in the studio was palpable as Demi Moore sat across from the panel of The View, her latest film garnering critical acclaim and Oscar buzz. But what should have been a victory lap turned into one of the most explosive confrontations in daytime television history. This wasn't your typical celebrity interview going slightly off the rails. This was a full-scale verbal battle that had the audience gasping, the producers scrambling, and social media exploding in real time. Before we get into exactly what set off this powder keg, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and drop a comment below telling me whose side you're on in this clash. The interview started innocently enough. Whoopi Goldberg opened with warm praise for Moore's performance, calling it a career-defining moment. Joy Behar chimed in with her characteristic humor, making lighthearted jokes about Moore's longevity in Hollywood. Sunny Hostin asked thoughtful questions about the film's themes of aging and identity in the entertainment industry. Moore was gracious, articulate, and clearly passionate about the project. She spoke about the vulnerability required for the role, the months of preparation, and how the character resonated with her own experiences navigating an industry that often discards women of a certain age. Then Alyssa Farah Griffin leaned forward with a question that shifted the entire atmosphere. Her tone was different, sharper, more pointed. She brought up Moore's previous comments in interviews about ageism in Hollywood, then pivoted to ask why Moore had remained silent when younger actresses spoke out about their own experiences with exploitation in the industry. The implication was clear. Moore had benefited from the system and only spoke up when it personally affected her. Moore's expression changed instantly. The warm smile faded. Her posture stiffened. There was a pause, just long enough for everyone watching to sense that something had shifted. When she spoke, her voice was measured, but there was steel underneath. She said it was interesting that Alyssa would frame it that way, considering Moore had been speaking about these issues for decades, long before it was fashionable or career-enhancing to do so. She pointed out that she had taken career risks and faced industry backlash for being outspoken when many others stayed silent. Alyssa didn't back down. She pressed further, saying that speaking about ageism now, when Moore was experiencing a career resurgence, was convenient timing. She suggested that Moore's activism seemed selective, only appearing when it benefited her narrative. The other hosts shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Whoopi tried to interject with a joke to lighten the mood, but both Moore and Alyssa ignored her. Moore leaned forward, her eyes locked on Alyssa. She said she found it remarkable that someone who had spent years working in political communications, crafting messages for powerful men, was now sitting in judgment of women who had actually fought battles in their industries. The words hung in the air like a bomb. The audience let out a collective gasp. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. This was personal. Alyssa's face flushed. She responded that her political background had nothing to do with this conversation and that deflecting to her past instead of addressing the question was exactly the kind of avoidance she was talking about. She accused Moore of using her platform to rebrand herself as an advocate while ignoring her own complicity in a system that had harmed others. The tension ratcheted up another notch. Moore's voice rose slightly, though she maintained control. She said that what Alyssa was doing right now, attempting to tear down a woman under the guise of accountability, was a tactic she had seen 1,000 times. She said it was particularly disappointing coming from another woman, someone who should understand the double standards and impossible positions women in public life are placed in. Joy Behar attempted to redirect, asking Moore about her preparation for the film's most challenging scenes, but Moore wasn't ready to move on. She turned to Joy and said she appreciated the question but felt it was important to address what was happening here because it represented a larger problem. She said that women are constantly asked to answer for every moment of their lives, to justify every choice, to prove their worthiness over and over again in ways men simply aren't. Alyssa jumped back in, saying that holding people accountable isn't tearing them down, it's necessary. She argued that Moore's defensiveness was revealing, that if she had truly been the advocate she claimed to be, these questions wouldn't feel like attacks. She said the public deserved to know whether Moore's current activism was genuine or performative. Moore's composure finally cracked. Not into anger exactly, but into something more raw. She said she had been in this industry for over 4 decades. She had been scrutinized, criticized, reduced to her appearance, her relationships, her personal struggles. She had been written off more times than she could count. And through all of it, she had continued to work, to speak up when it mattered, and to pave the way for other women whether they acknowledged it or not. She said that what bothered her most about this line of questioning was the assumption that her advocacy needed to be perfect to be valid, that she needed to have been flawless in every moment of her career to deserve a platform now. She asked Alyssa directly, "When did you start speaking publicly about women's issues? When did it become safe enough for you to do so? And should we discount everything you say now because you worked for an administration that many would argue was harmful to women?" The comparison was devastating. Alyssa's jaw tightened. She responded that her work in politics was about trying to create change from within, about being a voice of reason in difficult circumstances. Moore nodded slowly and said, "Exactly, which is what many of us have been trying to do in our own industries, in our own ways, with the tools and platforms we had available at the time." Sunny Hostin finally managed to interject, trying to find common ground. She suggested that perhaps both women were coming from valid perspectives, that the conversation about accountability and grace was complex. But Alyssa cut her off, insisting this wasn't about grace, it was about honesty. Moore turned to look directly at Alyssa and said, "You want honesty? Here's honesty. You came into this interview with an agenda. This wasn't about my film or my work. This was about making a name for yourself by taking down someone the audience might actually respect. And that's fine. That's your choice. But don't dress it up as journalism or accountability. Own what you're doing." The studio fell silent. Even the audience, which had been murmuring and gasping throughout, went completely quiet. Whoopi's eyes widened. Joy looked between the two women like she was watching a tennis match. Sarah Haynes, who had been mostly quiet, seemed frozen. Alyssa's response was immediate and sharp. She said that Moore's accusation was completely unfounded and unfair. She insisted her questions were legitimate and that Moore's reaction proved she couldn't handle scrutiny. She said it was disappointing to see someone she had admired respond so defensively to reasonable questions. Moore laughed, but there was no humor in it. She said, "Reasonable questions. You ambushed me on national television, questioned my integrity, my motives, and my life's work, and when I defend myself, suddenly I'm defensive and can't handle scrutiny." She shook her head. "This is the game, isn't it? Women are supposed to sit quietly while they're interrogated, smile through the accusations, and if they dare to push back, they're difficult, they're defensive, they're problematic." The conversation had reached a boiling point. What started as a celebrity interview had become something much bigger, a public confrontation about credibility, accountability, and the impossible standards women face in the public eye. And it was far from over. Whoopi attempted once more to steer things back, suggesting they take a commercial break. But Moore wasn't finished. She turned to the camera, speaking directly to the audience at home. She said, "I came here today to talk about a film I'm incredibly proud of, a story about a woman fighting to be seen and valued in a world that wants to erase her. And instead, I'm sitting here being told my voice doesn't matter unless it meets someone else's standard of perfection. If that isn't proof of why this film matters, I don't know what is." Alyssa sat back in her chair, her expression hardening. She said that Moore's attempt to play the victim was transparent and manipulative. She argued that powerful celebrities who cry persecution when asked legitimate questions were undermining actual victims of systemic oppression. She said Moore had every advantage, every privilege, every platform, and using those advantages to deflect criticism was exactly the kind of behavior that deserved scrutiny. Moore's eyes narrowed. She said it was fascinating that Alyssa kept using the word victim, as if acknowledging unfair treatment was the same as claiming victimhood. She pointed out that she had never once claimed to be a victim, but she also refused to pretend that the industry she worked in, or the media landscape they were currently participating in, treated women fairly. She said there was a difference between acknowledging reality and playing victim, and conflating the two was intellectually dishonest. Joy Behar tried to interject with more force. She said that both women were making interesting points, but perhaps they could find some common ground. She suggested that the real enemy was the system itself, not each other. But her attempt at peacemaking fell flat. Alyssa turned to Joy and said, "With respect, this isn't about finding common ground when someone is being dishonest." She turned back to Moore, bringing up specific instances when other actresses had faced public scandals and Moore had remained silent. She asked why Moore hadn't used her platform then to defend them, to speak out against the unfair treatment they received. Moore's response was swift. She said it was incredibly presumptuous of Alyssa to assume she knew what Moore had or hadn't done privately. She said that not every act of support happened on social media or in press statements. She had made phone calls, sent messages, offered advice and resources to other women in the industry. She had also learned that sometimes the most helpful thing she could do was respect someone's privacy and not turn their struggles into public spectacle for her own benefit. She looked directly at Alyssa and said, "Which is something you might want to consider right now. Just because you don't see someone's activism playing out on a public stage doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But I understand that concept might be foreign to someone whose entire career has been built on public performance." The insult landed hard. Alyssa's face reddened. She said that Moore's condescension was showing her true colors. She accused Moore of looking down on her because of her political background, of dismissing her as less than because she hadn't spent decades in Hollywood. She said it was elitist and revealed more about Moore's character than anything else. Sunny Hostin jumped in, saying that personal attacks weren't productive and suggested they refocus on the broader issues, but Moore shook her head. She said this had become personal the moment Alyssa decided to question her integrity and motives. She said she was simply responding in kind. Whoopi made a more forceful attempt to intervene. She said they needed to take a breath, that everyone was getting heated and losing sight of what should have been a celebration. She suggested they reset and talk about the film itself. But Alyssa wasn't done. She said she didn't think they should move on without Moore actually answering the questions. She repeated her point about selective activism, saying that Moore still hadn't provided a satisfactory explanation for why she only seemed to speak up about issues when they directly affected her career trajectory. Moore leaned back and crossed her arms. She said she found it remarkable that Alyssa felt entitled to determine what constituted a satisfactory answer. She said she had explained her position multiple times, but Alyssa kept asking the same question in different ways, hoping for what? An admission of guilt? An apology for not living her life according to Alyssa's standards? She continued, saying that this was the problem with the current media environment. People no longer interviewed to learn or understand. They interviewed to trap, to catch someone in a contradiction, to create a viral moment. She said Alyssa wasn't interested in her actual answer. She was interested in a soundbite that would get attention. Alyssa shot back, saying that if Moore's answers were genuine, they would stand on their own merit. The fact that Moore felt trapped by straightforward questions suggested she knew her position didn't hold up under examination. She said, accountability shouldn't feel like a trap unless you have something to hide. Moore stayed focused on Alyssa. She said that what bothered her most wasn't the questions themselves. Difficult questions came with public life. What bothered her was the presumption underlying them, the assumption that she owed Alyssa a complete accounting of her entire life and career, and that any gap in that accounting invalidated everything else. She said, "You want to talk about my silence on certain issues? Fine, let's talk about yours. You worked in the White House. You were part of an administration that implemented policies many people found harmful. Where were your public objections then? Where was your activism? And before you say you were working from within, ask yourself why that excuse is acceptable for you, but not for anyone else trying to navigate complex systems." Alyssa's composure wavered. She said the comparison was false equivalence, that her role in government was fundamentally different from Moore's position as a celebrity. She argued that she had left that administration and spoken out about its failings, which showed growth and accountability. Moore pounced on that. She said, "Exactly. You allowed yourself growth and complexity. You allowed yourself the nuance of good intentions in difficult circumstances. You gave yourself the benefit of the doubt. So why can't you extend that same courtesy to others? Why are you allowed evolution but I'm held to every position I've ever taken, every word I've ever said, every moment I wasn't publicly fighting every battle?" The question hung in the air. For the first time, Alyssa seemed at a loss for words. The audience was completely silent. The other hosts exchanged glances, uncertain how to proceed. This had gone far beyond a typical heated discussion. Whoopi tried once more to regain control. She turned to Moore and asked about her director's vision for the film, clearly hoping to steer the conversation back to safer territory. Moore took a breath, seeming to consider whether to let it go, but then she turned back to Alyssa one more time. She said she wanted to be clear about something. This wasn't about being unable to handle criticism or tough questions. She had faced far worse in her career. This was about the pattern, the exhausting pattern of women being held to impossible standards while watching others, particularly men, skate by with a fraction of the scrutiny. She said that Alyssa's questions would never be asked of a male actor in the same position. A man promoting a film after a career resurgence wouldn't be interrogated about every moment he hadn't been publicly activist enough. He wouldn't be asked to justify his entire life's work before being allowed to discuss his current project. Alyssa pushed back immediately. She said that bringing gender into it was a deflection, that she would ask the same questions of a man. She said that anyone with a platform had a responsibility to use it consistently, and that calling out inconsistency wasn't gendered, it was ethical. Moore asked her directly, "Name one time you've done an interview like this with a male guest. Name one time you've spent an entire segment questioning a man's credibility, his activism, his right to speak on issues." Alyssa opened her mouth to respond, but paused. The silence stretched out uncomfortably. Joy jumped in, trying to lighten the mood. She made a joke about how they'd all learned not to mess with Demi Moore. A few audience members laughed nervously, but the underlying conflict remained unresolved. Sarah Haynes spoke up, her voice careful. She said she thought there was something valuable in what Moore was saying about the different standards applied to women. She shared her own experiences feeling judged more harshly than her male colleagues. She said maybe this whole exchange was actually proving Moore's point. Alyssa looked frustrated. She said she appreciated Sarah's perspective but disagreed that this was about gender. She maintained that her questions were legitimate, regardless of who she was asking them to. She said refusing to examine that logic because the person being questioned was a woman was actually doing women a disservice. Moore leaned forward. She said Alyssa could maintain that position all she wanted, but the proof was in the pattern. She said she'd been doing interviews for over 40 years, and she knew the difference between genuine curiosity and an interrogation. She knew the difference between a conversation and a takedown. And this had been the latter from the moment Alyssa opened her mouth. She said what really bothered her was that Alyssa was smart enough to know exactly what she was doing. This wasn't ignorance or accident. This was a choice to use this platform, this moment, to go after someone for reasons that had nothing to do with legitimate journalism. Alyssa's voice rose. She said Moore's accusations were unfounded and unfair. She said she was a professional doing her job, asking the questions that needed to be asked. She said that Moore's defensiveness and personal attacks were revealing that someone with nothing to hide wouldn't be reacting this way. Moore laughed, shaking her head. She said, "There it is again. The trap. If I answer calmly, I'm being evasive. If I push back, I'm being defensive. If I point out the unfairness of your questions, I'm attacking you. There's no right way to respond, because the game is rigged from the start." She said that was the brilliance of this kind of interview technique. The person asking the questions got to maintain the high ground of objectivity while putting the subject in an impossible position. And if the subject called it out, they just proved they couldn't handle accountability. Sunny tried to find a synthesis. She said that perhaps both things could be true, that questions about public figures' consistency were fair, and that the way those questions were asked mattered. She suggested that maybe the tone and framing of Alyssa's questions had made them feel more like attacks than legitimate inquiry. Alyssa rejected that framing. She said her tone had been professional throughout, and that Moore was reading hostility into straightforward questions because she didn't like being challenged. Moore addressed the audience directly. She said she wanted to thank those who could see the unfairness because it mattered. She said too often, people witnessed these kinds of exchanges and stayed silent, uncertain if they were really seeing what they thought they were seeing. She turned back to the panel. She said that what had happened here today was a perfect microcosm of a larger problem. Women couldn't just exist in public spaces. They had to constantly justify that existence. They had to prove they deserved their platforms, their success, their voices. And the standards for that proof kept changing until it was impossible to ever truly measure up. Whoopi nodded slowly. She said Moore was touching on something real, something she herself had experienced throughout her career. She said there was a particular kind of scrutiny that came with being a woman in entertainment. Alyssa looked around the table, clearly feeling outnumbered. She said she found it disappointing that her colleagues were piling on rather than supporting legitimate journalism. She said this was exactly the problem with identity politics, that valid criticism got shut down the moment someone claimed it was discriminatory. Moore said that using the term identity politics to dismiss concerns about sexism was a convenient way to avoid actually engaging with the substance of those concerns. She said Alyssa kept falling back on the claim that her questions were legitimate, but she refused to examine whether the way she had asked them, the assumptions behind them, and the context were fair. She said journalism wasn't just about asking questions. It was about seeking truth. And seeking truth required good faith, intellectual honesty, and a genuine openness to understanding rather than confirming pre-existing conclusions. She said Alyssa had demonstrated none of those qualities today. Alyssa's jaw tightened. She said Moore's characterization of her work and her integrity was offensive. She said she had come into this interview prepared, with legitimate questions based on research. She said if Moore couldn't handle that level of preparation and scrutiny, that said more about Moore than about her. Moore stood up, not to leave, but to emphasize her next point. She said she could handle any level of scrutiny. What she wouldn't accept was pretending that this had been a good faith interview. She said she had done enough of these to know the difference. She said Alyssa could try to rewrite what had happened here, could claim objectivity and professionalism, but everyone watching knew what they had witnessed. The standing added a new level of intensity. Whoopi asked Moore to sit back down, saying they could finish the conversation civilly. Moore sat, but her point had been made. Sunny suggested they wrap up by letting Moore actually talk about her film, the thing she had come to discuss in the first place. She asked Moore what she hoped audiences would take away from the story. Moore collected herself. She said the film was about a woman fighting to be seen, to be valued, to be heard in a world that wanted to silence her. She said it was about the courage it took to keep showing up, keep speaking up, even when you knew you'd be torn apart for it. She said it was about refusing to accept that your worth was determined by other people's judgments. She said, and I think what happened here today actually illustrates exactly why this story matters. Because even now, even after everything we've supposedly learned about how we treat women in public life, we're still doing this. We're still demanding perfection. We're still looking for reasons to discredit and dismiss. Alyssa started to respond, but Whoopi cut her off. She said they were out of time and needed to wrap up. She thanked Moore for coming on the show and for what she described as a robust conversation. She turned to the camera and went to commercial, her face showing the strain of moderating one of the most contentious interviews in the show's history. As the show came back for final remarks, Whoopi said that sometimes conversations got heated, and that was okay. She said disagreement was healthy, and that both Moore and Alyssa had raised important points worth considering. Moore had the final word. She looked directly into the camera and said, "To everyone watching, especially young women, don't let anyone make you feel like you have to be perfect to deserve to be heard. Don't let anyone convince you that having a voice means submitting to endless interrogation about whether you've earned that right. Your voice matters. Your experiences matter. And you don't have to justify your existence to anyone." The audience erupted in applause. It was clear where the majority of support lay. Alyssa sat, stone-faced, her colleagues looking uncomfortable. And Demi Moore had given one of the most powerful performances of her career, not on screen, but in defending herself and every woman who had ever been told to sit down and shut up. If you want to see more breakdowns of the most explosive moments in entertainment, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And drop a comment below telling me, do you think Alyssa crossed a line? Or was she just doing her job as a journalist?